My name is Jerome Fascione, and I've spent the last 3 decades learning and teaching about African American history. I was raised in a multicultural home where I was taught to seek the truth and work toward justice. You see, it is my belief that through education and the pursuit of truth, we can fix the injustices that exist in the world. I welcome you to Time Out for Black History. I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of Time Out for Black History. Let me start by asking everybody to hit the subscribe button. Go to Time Out for Black History, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell so that you get the updates, so you know when a new episode comes out. And please continue to share. You know, people are doing a great job. I'm up to, I think, 2,500 subscribers now, which means a lot of people are getting access to this information. Getting a lot of great comments, a lot of negative comments. And the good thing is most of the negative comments are simply about Black history, not about the podcast, but the fact that they don't think that this should be taught for a wide range of reasons. But please continue to support me and help me out by helping this grow and by listening. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed the episode. So today in episode 8, I want to look at the question of what killed slavery. Okay. Now I'm not asking the question of what caused the Civil War. The Civil War was a war fought for a lot of different reasons. One of those reasons being states' rights, one of them being representation, and one of them being the institution of slavery. I just want to focus primarily on that question of what killed slavery. Because again, it goes back to a premise I keep going back to, which is the white moderate is so important to any semblance of advancement in this country that the Black individual has ever seen. Whether it was the 1950s and white moderates supporting the civil rights movement, whether it was the most recent Black Lives Matter movements in which just as many whites were out walking in the streets in support. And so for any progress, we're going to need to see the white moderate. So we go all the way back to the mid-1800s, and it's the same story. So I'm going to talk about a specific individual. So I'm going to talk about 2 different things. One of them today, one of them in the next episode. This will be 8A, that'll be 8B. In 8A, we're going to be talking about an individual who was so detrimental to the institution of slavery because he broke every stereotype of why slavery was this great paternalistic institution that was set up to help the slave. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a ton of people. In my African American Experience class, we talk about all the different people who contributed. I don't have time for that with this. I'm going to talk about one individual that I see as the face of that. And that individual was Frederick Douglass. And not just the stereotyped Frederick Douglass, but the tell a story of the real individual, and you know the fact that born a slave, which most everybody knows, he goes on to become a free man through his own escape. He's going to go on to become a prominent activist in the abolition movement. He's going to become an author and a public speaker, and he does all this relatively through his own hard work. He got help along the way, which is kind of where I go to when I talk about with the help of the white moderate. So think about this individual born into slavery in 1818 in Maryland. He doesn't know his birth date. No one knows his birth date. The records weren't kept. He was born of mixed heritage. His mother was Native American, and his father was mixed Black and European descent. But none of that mattered back then. Any black blood made you Black. And so he essentially was relegated to a slave. Now, he was taught to read the alphabet by the wife of one of the people who originally owned him. He credits Sophia with teaching him the alphabet. From there, he taught himself to read. And after that, he's going to go on to begin to teach others to read, primarily through the Bible, by using the Bible. So he's going to start educating other slaves. Now, when word of him educating other slaves goes around, he's going to be sold to a plantation, the Covey plantation. And there he's going to be punished severely for those actions. So what Frederick Douglass decides to do at that point, he tries several escape attempts. And after several attempts, he finds success. So he finally escapes and he makes his way to New York. And in New York, he stays at the home of David Ruggles. Okay, that's all part of the Underground Railroad and these series of safe houses. So he finally arrives there. And it's there that he becomes more of a mainstream piece of the abolitionist movement. He gets married, he's going to have a family, 5 children, but he's become a prominent piece of that civil rights movement. And a lot of it is going to be as a result of his dealings with William Lloyd Garrison, who was a prominent white abolitionist at the time. He's going to read a lot of his writings, and he's going to kind of fully begin to develop his own position. Now, he also is going to go on a tour for 6 months as a part of a group that's going around discussing what it meant to be a slave. So here you have an individual who goes on to become probably the greatest orator of the 1800s, who's able to articulate out his experiences in the institution of slavery, the fact that he self-educated himself, and became one of the most prominent members of society. So this essentially threw a wrench into any description that said that slaves were unfit, that blacks were unfit to essentially take care of themselves. And so this opened the door to the argument of how many other Frederick Douglasses have existed that have been destroyed by this institution of slavery. Now, anyone he didn't reach through this tour, which was a lot of people, because again, this isn't a globalized world with television and things like that. He's going to go on to write his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1860, which is going to further be able to explain the horrible injustices of this institution. He talks about how he kept strong will throughout this ordeal, that he always saw the light at the end of the tunnel, and that this institution would not be able to hold him down. He also made a point to emphasize that the slave was as big of a victim as the slaveholder was also in this horrible institution. That this institution had been passed on from generation to generation. But hearing somebody be able to so eloquently explain the institution of slavery allowed the Southern depiction of slavery to be thrown to the side. And again, like I said before, there were others doing the same thing. But Frederick Douglass became that prominent voice that hit the white moderate and allowed them to better understand what this institution really was. Now, you can see, he also is getting into real big arguments with Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass says, you didn't go far enough. You didn't grant blacks the right to vote. So he wasn't very, and later on in his life, when he visits other countries, he's going to talk about how the freedom of the black man in those countries was a fresher breath air compared to what life was like for blacks in America. But his ability to reach moderate, black Americans already knew what slavery was. White moderate Americans were not aware fully of what the institution of slavery was because they were disconnected from Southern life. And so I always equate it to very similarly to the use of television in the civil rights movement. When white moderates were sitting in their homes in New York and watching kids in Birmingham, Alabama being hit with water hoses and police dogs, it allowed them to better understand the institution of segregation and the hate that existed. So Frederick Douglass was so important in creating that. I suggest you read his 4th of July speech, which does a great job talking about why it's not our 4th of July speech. And so further get into Frederick Douglass a little more to understand a little bit more about who he was and what he did. But hopefully this introduced you a little bit more to his important role and the white moderates' important role in helping fuel the energy behind the abolitionist movement, which allowed our government to eventually use force to bring an end to this institution. So again, subscribe to the channel, please, and hit like if you enjoyed the video, and please share it with other people. Thank you for tuning in.